met as a graduate student at the University of Chicago. She comes to us now from Northwestern University, where she's the Mary Jane Crowe Professor of Art and Art History. But her graduate training was at Chicago. She taught there for many years after getting her degree. Backing up, as she will be doing in history, she was an undergraduate at Harvard, if I remember correctly, in history and literature, not in art history. So the cultural dimension of her curiosity is really exemplified by the kind of undergraduate work that she did. And her only 2 books I'll refer to. She's the author of an enormous number of collaborations with artists, with performers, contemporary artists, cultural activists, but 2 really seminal works that relate to our general topic here today. One came out of her dissertation on art at Fontainebleau, the great chateau of the King Francis I in the early 16th century. And it was called Blood, Milk, Ink, and Gold. And it really studies the, not just pigments or just not materials, but sees the underlying power and fecundity of what we might think of as materials and pigments and so forth, and relates that really to a theory of state, to an entirely larger profusion of cultural indices. A later book is called The Passionate Triangle, in which she relates mathematical thinking, not just to compositions of balanced versions in children and painting, which is the way conventional art historians have to say had been thinking about it, but again, in terms of underlying concepts of relationships among entities, dealing with the triangle, in other words, at a much more abstract level than just what you see is not really just what you get. There is still something really much more underlying to it. So I expect her talk, those which have undergone no such alteration, fossils, race, and transformation, 17th century Europe and beyond, will once again take us way beneath just what those terms mean. Rebecca?
Thank you so much, Linda. It was just such a pleasure to receive your invitation to this event. And I'm going to put this on. Okay. How's that? Is that okay? And I just want to thank all of the organizers, Herman, Pamela, and Linda. Also want to thank Emily, including for the great recommendation of the mini golf Pirates Cove, which the resident owner of a lizard in my household greatly enjoyed. And it's also just really wonderful to be doing a kind of academic event in Maine, where I grew up. I grew up in Brunswick. My dad's an ichthyologist, so it all somehow seems to come together. Okay, and also just have to show my Daphne since we all, it seems like, part of the theme, just to think back to the fact that one of my very first graduate seminars was with Linda on transformation, on Ovid's Metamorphoses, and that was just a very formative experience for me, and so it's a great kind of coming full circle. So I am currently working on a book on the idea of nature as artist, and that is so a portion of that is what I'll be presenting today, and I'm presenting sort of the more history of science side of it, but the sort of general theme is the idea of ways in which nature was thought of as a creative force that didn't just produce organisms and help promote reproduction of organisms, but also created artifacts, created things that looked like images. And then there's a whole question of like, what is a thing that looks like an image? Is it really an image, or is it something that looks like one, a pseudomorph? So these are some examples of 15th century artists creating fictive marble that contains something that they thought of as an image, right? So a face in a block of painted marble. And I have another quote from Leon Battista Alberti. It's evident that nature herself delights in painting, for we observe she often fashions in marble hippocentaurs and bearded faces of kings. So we've got some bearded faces of kings, or maybe self-portraits of the artists in certain cases. The Botticelli on the far right is more of a kind of incipient image where he, as an artist, is kind of imagining, at least in my view, is imagining that he can kind of do one better on nature, right? This is the kind of image that nature creates, but he can create images that that are superior, that show kind of ability to reproduce substances in all their materiality. The idea of imitation, also really important. The idea of nature as imitator of nature herself, nature as imitator of things in the world, some of which nature created. And even things, there are even things like fossils that were thought to be nature's representation of bread or of cheese or other kinds of things that are actually human artifacts. So the idea that nature could actually imitate artifacts. I also want to flag in relation to the previous talk that that the idea of imperfect generation or regeneration is going to be a theme here as well. So this is one of my key figures, Ulisse Aldrovandis, a scientist, a kind of polymath figure in Bologna in the 16th century. A lot of his writings are kind of later, second half of the 16th century, but a lot of them are not published until the 17th century, where they have a kind of renewed impact when they're published later on after his death. So he's looking at lots of different kinds of formations in stone and different kinds of minerals, and thinking about ways in which ways in which nature creates images in stone. So let's see if I can get okay here. So if you see this face here, so this is a representation in a woodcut of a stone that has an image of a face, much like the ones that the artists, the 15th century artists, 14th and 15th century artists I showed in the last slide, are representing in fresco in paint. And then he's also looking at fossils. So he's looking at things that are marble that's been cut and book matched to create something that looks like an image. He's looking at these sort of random, naturally occurring formations that look like images. And then he's looking at fossils and thinking of those two as images that nature has created. And this goes along with the whole idea of nature as mother, the idea of mother nature, and 16th century images and 17th century images of nature as a kind of a profusely maternal figure, a personification. A lot of times I get in presenting this material, I get the objection, well, didn't Christians in the 16th or 17th century just think of nature as God? If nature is creating something, doesn't that really mean that it's God who's creating it? And to some, that was certainly true. But to others, there was a really kind of robust notion of nature as a force that's distinct from divine force. So nature can be the minister of God, but nature can have her own agency in various different kind of different thinkers' ideas. And one of the ways that we can tell that this was something that was seriously thought about is the extent of pushback against it that certain other writers present in their work. So kind of disparaging the notion of nature as a kind of personification. So Robert Boyle writes a whole book about the vulgarly received notion of nature, which is very much a kind of attack on the idea of nature as a separately intending force or a personification. So this is kind of all to sort of present the sort of general context of my project. I'm going to talk about some sort of specific ideas that have to do with fossils and how they were understood in the late 16th and into the 17th century and a little bit into the 18th century. So with that as a backdrop, I'm going to talk about, and my alarm is going off, I'm not quite sure why that is. I'm going to talk about spontaneous generation. So Pamela referred to this and at greater length, and I'll just kind of briefly refer to it here in terms of this idea of animals growing out of rotting meat or cheese or other kinds of frogs growing out of mud, which when it's presented in sort of standard canonical history of science, is a sort of idea that's you know, part of this sort of legacy of ancient authorities that were still being followed in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, that were kind of benighted ideas that then are superseded by modern science. But one of the things that I think, and Pamela's work very much goes to this as well, one of the things that seems clear to me in looking at the material of how people are thinking in the 16th and 17th centuries is that there's really renewed energy to the notion of spontaneous generation. It is drawing on ancient and medieval precedents, but there's renewed energy that comes from observations and other kinds of data that's being assimilated by European thinkers in this early modern period. So it's not just a kind of holdover of older ways of thinking. One of those kinds of pieces of information is the comparative visual data of shells, shellfish, mollusks that are being brought to Europe from other parts of the world and compared with the fossil record that exists. So you may be able to see on the floor of the Duomo in Parma. Whoops, I did what I was not supposed to do. How do I get back here? Okay, great. So I need to do this. Okay, so here's an ammonite fossil in the floor of the Duomo in Parma. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these ammonites in floors in Italian churches. And so for a very long time, these were thought to be coiled snakes. And it was nature producing an image of a snake in stone. And then, this is another Franken kind of a small kind of cabinet of naturalia and of art. The importation of shells starts to kind of pick up in the later Middle Ages into the early modern period, and producing the possibility of comparative data, right, between actual modern shells and the shells that appear in stone. This is red Verona marble, which is full of ammonites. So looking at shells and looking at fossils and thinking comparatively about them, we might think this is what led to the modern understanding of fossils. Actually, the modern understanding of fossils as petrified, formerly living organisms existed very, very, very early on, and it was kind of a ebb and flow of ideas more than it was something that came in just with Leonardo or just with the 17th century scientific revolution. It's something that was talked about in the Middle Ages, the idea of fossils as petrified remains of formerly living creatures. And so one of the new ideas that's actually coming in this period is the view that Aldrovandi proposed. I'm going to go back to Aldrovandi and think about how he understands the idea of fossils as organisms that grow partially in stone. They grow partially and not fully, although they could grow fully. And that's where the idea of spontaneous generation comes in, that the fossil is something that could have been a spontaneously generated organism, but instead it got stopped at some point in its development. So the comparative information of modern shells that come into Europe of a scale, of the size that Europeans were already used to seeing in stone, is one thing that we might think that it produces the idea of petrification as the source of fossils, but actually it also serves as a source of new ideas about spontaneous generation. Another source of ideas about spontaneous generation is European encounters in the Americas with indigenous people. So the idea that if there are indigenous people in the Americas, where did they come from, right? Were they spontaneously generated there? So this is a kind of produces a discourse of speculations about, is there a whole separate creation in the Americas? Is there spontaneous generation of plants and animals and human beings? Or how do we Europeans understand how people came to be in the Americas? So there are a lot of things kind of entering into questions that people had in the 16th and 17th centuries. So Aldrovandi is thinking about the idea of nature as maker, as creator. This is a quote from one of his manuscripts. Nature, minister of Almighty God, is neither inert nor idle, but she labors and fashions many great things and adorns not only the surface, but also the deep and hidden bosom and inmost recesses of the earth. So he's thinking about how organisms are being generated inside the earth. Okay, and he's working still with an Aristotelian model called hylomorphism, where living beings and substances are formed from the combination of form and matter. And that happens in natural production. It also happens in artificial production. So the idea in the craftsman's mind is the form that is then invested into the matter that creates the artifact. And Aristotle constantly uses this analogy to think about how do living species come into being. And it's something that then is repeated over and over again by thinkers who followed Aristotle. On the right, you see a quote from Albertus Magnus, which was a very kind of important, who was a very important figure for people like Aldrovandi, although Aldrovandi eventually moves past Albertus Magnus and into a different way of thinking about the formation of things like images in stone, right? So Albertus Magnus, also working with this Aristotelian framework, is thinking about how you get the things like that I showed in one of the very first images, the faces in the stone, right, or the images in stone. And he thinks of it as something that comes from celestial influence. So the influence of the planetary bodies, there's a kind of particular astrological conjunction that happens, which produces form in a place where that form would not normally be. So outside of the normal workings of reproduction, there's a separate form that gets imposed on the matter of a stone. Rather than simply reproducing stone in its normal form, it's actually something that's imposed from outside. So this is something that Aldrovandi initially picks up. So Albertus Magnus is a 13th century Dominican who's very influential on ideas about natural history in a lot of different ways. Aldrovandi over the course of a series of observations, starts thinking about natural forms that appear in stone as being the result of something that grows in the stone itself. So a combination of salt and sand and water, that's this kind of universal humor existing under the crust of the earth that is over time producing organisms or part organisms. So this is this idea of imperfect generation, that the fossil is the result of nature trying to produce an organism, but it doesn't quite make it into its fullest realization. So one of the things that Aldrovandi comes up with, and he draws on Arab scientists for this, is the idea of the dator formarum, the giver of forms, which he thinks of as something that infuses the entire universe, that when the matter in a particular place comes together, whether the different elements, earth, air, water, fire, the combination comes together that could enable the production of life. The dator formarum, the giver of forms, is what is sort of triggered to produce life in that moment. So he takes from the idea of these kind of anecdotes of frogs that are found inside a block of stone. And this is an example he cites of, this is not his image, this is a later instance. This is actually something that was kind of commonly reported in Europe in the early modern period, the idea that frogs could grow inside blocks of stone. So he tells the story of a, quote, certain mason of Antwerp who found a living toad in the middle of a block of marble. And taking that example, he says, if moisture was found in that place suitable for a toad, what prevents it from being found anywhere in stones in which sea animals are also generated? Living, if the place and humor warrant, or at any rate embodied, if the humor does not permit life. And he goes on to say that the datura formarum imparts forms in the air to frogs and small fish, there to mice and worms, and to other animals born from the mud, from matter previously prepared by the sky. So this idea of this sort of celestial influence is still there kind of in the background, but it's not what's giving the form. It's not a conjunction of planets. It's not astrology that's producing the form that's then imprinted on the matter on Earth. Therefore, wherever liquid is found, a suitable living shell is generated to support a living mollusk, but where the matter is capable of producing a form adequate to the shell, but is not endowed with a suitable humor for a living organism, it is possible that only the shell, not the organism, will be generated. So it's a kind of partial generation. And he kind of punts the question of how is it that this that this partial generation happens. He goes back to Aristotle for the analogy of the craftsman. He says, for the craftsman advances as far as his material permits, progressing beyond, if not prohibited by a failing of place and matter. So very often, this is very similar to his explanation for monsters, how are monsters produced. It's not that nature is it's not so much that nature is intending to produce monsters or is intending to kind of play with organisms or materiality, but that there's some kind of error or some kind of obstruction. He talks about an analogy between the writer whose ink fails him, like he runs out of ink, or the ink isn't the right preparation, isn't able to write in the way that he would normally write. So it's nature kind of it's kind of an error of inscription in a sense. When nature isn't able to produce the kind of fully formed organism, but produces what we would think of as a fossil instead, right? So a stony organism that doesn't quite attain life. So one of the things, okay, let me go back actually. One of the things about this that is very interesting to me as an art historian, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on today, is the idea that what gets produced is an image. And there are a whole series of kind of debates about this notion of nature producing images, or that the partly formed animal or the partly formed organism is a kind of image of that organism. There are a lot of discussions of whether nature operates to aesthetic ends. If nature is operating as an artist, as a maker, is nature doing things just to beautify the world? Is that a function that can be properly attributed to nature? So there are debates on that. I'm not going to go into that, but I just wanted to kind of mark that as an aside. This notion of playful nature is another question that comes up very often in these discussions. So this idea of the fossil as a kind of spontaneously generated part organism is something that's pretty widespread in the early 17th century, starts to be challenged over the course of the 17th century and into the 18th century through a kind of mounting consensus that fossils, once again, that fossils were the petrified remains of formerly living organisms, and as opposed to the idea of an unfinished product of growth in the earth. So one of the kind of driving forces of this discourse is Thomas Burnett's Sacred Theory of the Earth. Here I'm relying very much on my Northwestern colleague, Lydia Barnett's work on this kind of body of material. But Thomas Burnett's Sacred Theory of the Earth, which posits this kind of the idea that the biblical flood was a universal flood that had a cataclysmic effect on the surface of the earth, on the geology and geography of the earth, which then gets picked up by people who are interested in fossil formation and thinking about how are fossils formed. So people like John Woodward and Johann Jakob Schweitzer. So this is a kind of mounting consensus, as I said, the idea that the biblical flood was universal. And that allowed new kinds of arguments to be made about how fossils were produced. And I'll say more about those in a moment. One kind of useful passage for kind of understanding what the different possibilities were that were being considered about how fossils were formed is one from John Ray from his 3 physico-theological discourses. So he says, it's not yet agreed among the learned whether these bodies, formerly called petrified shells, but nowadays passing by the name of formed stones, be original productions of nature formed in imitation of the shells of fishes, or the real shells themselves, either remaining still entire and uncorrupt, or petrified and turned into stone, or at least stones cast in some animal mold. So just to break this down, one possibility, and he thinks of this as a newer one, so they formerly were thought of as petrified shells, thinking specifically of shells. Formerly were thought of as petrified shells, now are thought of as original productions of nature, incomplete organisms growing in the earth. But then there's another kind of response to that theory, which is arguing once again that they're petrified organisms. The real shells themselves and possibilities under this include remaining still entire and uncorrupt, or petrified and turned into stone, or stones cast in some animal mold. And these possibilities, these 3 possibilities are going to be important. So hold on to that idea, remaining still entire and uncorrupt in particular. So this is kind of strange. Like I want to kind of point to the strangeness of this idea that the fossil is not just a cast kind of image of a formerly living organism. And I'm grateful to Pamela for your presentation, so I don't have to explain what casting is. So this is great. But the possibility existed because there were many thinkers who were thinking about fossils in those precise terms, that they were a kind of natural cast of a once living creature in much the way that we think of them today, right? That there's a cavity that's formed, which is then filled with some other kind of sedimentary material. And this explanation was available, but it's not what Woodward and Schweitzer and many of their colleagues chose. They insisted that fossils are the thing itself. They repeat this over and over again, the thing itself. So you can see here the quote that gave me the title of this talk in Woodward's text, An Essay Toward the Natural History of the Earth. The last paragraph on the screen, there being so very few of these, that's the ones that are petrified or that are casts, in comparison of those which have undergone no such alteration. There being, I say, besides these, such vast multitudes of shells contained in stone, which are entire, fair, and absolutely free from any such mineral contagion. So he insists over and over again that they're the shells themselves, the shellfish themselves, that the organism exists in its original material. It has not been transformed into some other material. And Schweitzer too repeats sort of similar ideas. This is a really wonderful text by Schweitzer called it's the Piscium Querelae and Vindicii, the complaints and revendications of the fishes, where he imagines a kind of allegorical story where fish are claiming their rights as members of the animal kingdom and not the mineral kingdom. So the fossil fish are saying, we are fish, we are not stone. They say in his fictive voice, we live in an age where rights are being trampled as much in nature as in politics. The fish argue that the mineral kingdom has usurped rights that belong to those of the plants and animals, and to them, the fish in particular. They're angered that fossil fish have been treated as spontaneous products of the earth, as opposed to being the remains of once living sea creatures who perished in the violence of the biblical flood, as they say, victims of the error of another race. So Schweitzer also insists that these objects are not mere images. So he uses terms like figura, figure, umbra, shadow, and delineazione, delineation or drawing. That's not what they are, but they are the thing itself, res ipsa in Latin. And it's ironic that the claim gets made and the sort of evidence for this position is with images, right? Is through the use of, for example, in this case, a very detailed etching by Johann Heinrich Huber of a fossilized pike. So within the fictive frame of the book, the narrative voice insists that the fossil is the thing itself, not a shadow of the thing. And you can see the text on the screen. Now present whatever archaeus, artisan, or subterranean demiurge you wish. And I think the subterranean demiurge is a reference to the Datur Formarum of Aldrovandi. And try to claim that this was not the body of a real fish, a real pike. Measure the proportions of the parts. We are contemplating the real thing, not the shadow of the thing, not some effigy of a fish elaborated by a painterly nature, but the fish itself. So, putting this in the context of the way the story of kind of ideas about fossils tends to be told in history of science, these guys are the sort of heroes. I mean, they're heroes in a way they're still kind of shackled to this sort of idea of like the Bible, biblical history, but they're the ones who are proposing the idea of the fossil as the remains of a once living organism, right? In contrast to someone like Aldrovandi and people who followed his views, who are thinking of them as things that grew spontaneously in the earth. But there are a lot of things that are problematic about what, and I'm not the first to say this, but there are things that are problematic about Woodward and Schweitzer's, in particular in their reliance on the idea of the biblical flood, right? This caused a kind of, their timeline is very problematic, right? They're thinking in terms of thousands of years as opposed to millions and billions of years. But it's interesting that they insist so much on this idea of the thing itself, and that seems interestingly problematic in their way of understanding what's going on with fossils. And as I said, it's also interesting because there were proposals that more closely represent our modern understanding, a scientific understanding of how fossils are formed, that they didn't take up. That they were interested in insisting that the fossil was the thing itself. So there's this kind of debate between what gets referred to as the diluvialist position, the position that the fossils are the remains of organisms that perished in the flood, on the one hand, and what I would call a vitalist position on the other, Aldrovandi and others who are thinking of fossils as things that are growing in the earth, that both in some ways reflect something other than, that they reflect ideologies, they reflect something other than simply observation. And I want to think a little bit about that in closing. So one could imagine that the emphasis on the thing itself has a kind of Protestant background, the idea of literalness, thinking about Protestant views of biblical scripture, that they're thinking in kind of literalist terms, rejecting representation, rejecting mysterious signs and commentary, and thinking about the thing itself. That would be one way of thinking about it. But I want to make a suggestion that it actually relates to a parallel discourse that might have made it feel right to late 17th, early 18th century thinkers to insist on the fossil as the thing itself. And that's the discourse of race in the early nascent colonial world of the 17th century. So both the diluvial and the vitalist theories are global in their own ways. As I mentioned earlier, there's new knowledge about fossils that relied on the evidence of materials that were being brought from all over the world, shells in particular, and other kinds of specimens. And new energy in the idea of spontaneous generation was also coming from the need to explain how there came to be indigenous people and other species in the Americas. So these situations of encounter and colonization that produce these speculations, and the theories of race that were produced to grease the wheels of colonization had parallels in the production of knowledge about fossils. So Woodward also published a handbook, Brief Instructions for Making Observations in All Parts of the World, and precisely what it says, how to take natural specimens and write about them on voyages around the world. So it's a kind of handbook that he used also to solicit correspondents who would send him specimens and drawings from their voyages. So among other observations that he proposed, he recommended that readers should note, quote, whether white people were moving into hot countries become by degrees browner, etc., and blacks were moving into cold countries paler. So this is a climate-based theory of race that suggested racial difference was caused by local climates, heat producing darker skin, cold producing lighter skin, etc. Another theory coming into prominence at this time was a hereditary theory of race that argued for persistent racial identity across generations and across geographies. So both theories had the potential to, both theories were racist in their own ways and had the potential to support racial oppression and hierarchy, but the hereditary view of race was giving new energy to the emerging global order of settler colonialism and enslavement in the 17th and 18th centuries, because it reassured Europeans that they would remain white and hence at the top of the hierarchy if they moved to a different climate, and enabled the continuing slavery of indigenous people of Africa and the Americas to be enforced by laws that were based in heredity. So race became a kind of transportable property that retained its identity around the globe rather than being shaped by local conditions. So think about climate theory of race, hereditary theory of race, so local origins, transformation, emphasis on diverse profusion of life. This has more to do with my next slide, but this idea of locally produced transformative ways of thinking about race. And then on the right, global origins, organisms travel long distances, but retain their specific species identity. And also an emphasis on mass death as productive of current state of affairs. The thing that I want to emphasize here is the idea that there are correspondences between the way race is being thought of in the climate framework and the way fossils are being thought of in the vitalist framework. So all these characteristics are shared by the climate theory of race and the vitalist theory of fossils. And then on the right, various characteristics are shared by the hereditary theory of race and the diluvialist theory of fossils. So organisms that are dispersed by the flood are transported into different places, but retain their identity, the thing itself. The fossil is the organism. It's not a representation of the organism, it is the thing itself. Just like the way race is increasingly being thought of in the hereditary theory of race, the white European retains their whiteness as they travel. They retain their original form. And then a sort of idea of life versus death as the sort of area of focus for how the state of affairs is being produced. Diverse profusion of life on the one hand, and the emphasis on mass death, which is a feature of the explanation that uses the biblical flood to understand how you get fossils. And it's also a kind of rationalization of what's actually occurring in the new colonial order of the globe. So I know I'm a little bit over. As much as in nature as in politics, Schweitzer has his fish say. And I'm not arguing here for a strong theory of causality that would explain the fossil theory as a direct and conscious expression of the racial theory, but I do find the congruences striking. These authors like Woodward and Schweitzer, depended for the raw materials of their scientific production, not only on worldwide travel, but also on violent colonial systems of racial hierarchy. I would suggest that the fossil theory rests on a structure of thinking that seemed right because of other structures of thinking that were essential to the developing economic order and new definitions of human nature. Insisting that the majority of fossils had undergone no alteration, I suggest that these authors imagined enduring confines of species identity that were as valid for themselves and their European compatriots in an age of global expansion as for the stony remains of mollusks and fishes whose origins prompted their endless speculation. Thank you. Yes.
How do